Hey, welcome to muscle car. They're probably the most made fun of parts ever used. If you got a GM muscle car, chances are it probably came with one. Hey, QuadraJet.
These carburetors, they've gotten a bad rap for a lot of years. They've been called leaky, unreliable, low performance, QuadraJunks. And today, we're going to show you guys why you shouldn't believe all the negative hype. QJets, well, they're capable of a lot of horsepower, and they're really not as complicated as you think.
If you're doing a stock restoration on your GM, you'll probably be dealing with one. So we'll show you the right way to get one purring like a kitten and roaring like a lion. Roar!
Now, the most common type of performance carburetor is probably the Holley. Now, Holley and most other carbs use what's known as a square bore design. That means that the primaries and the secondaries are the same size. Now, QuadraJet, they use a design that's unlike any other. They use smaller primaries to meet emission standards and give you better gas mileage, but huge secondaries to deliver the kind of performance that muscle car enthusiasts demand. And get this, a bone stock QJet, it can give you up to 800 CFM.
There's more than one style QuadraJet. Pontiac, Buick, and O's use the straight inlet, while Chevrolet used the 90-degree style. The late model carbs are equipped with a throttle position sensor and a mixture control solenoid. The amount of emissions equipment and even the car's options like AC or cruise control can even make a difference.
Now, models that came on early big blocks used a bigger bore, therefore they're more desirable. And you can tell these carburetors apart by the bump inside the primary bore. Now, the best way to tell which carburetor you have is by looking up the stamping number on the internet.
So why do they have such a bad reputation? If you've got one that's leaky or unreliable, it could be suffering from a bad rebuild or just simply worn out. A lot of people assume that since it's a stock carburetor that it's low performance, but that's just not true.
Now, we already told you guys that these things are capable of flowing up to 800 CFM. And a properly rebuilt and tuned QuadraJet, well, it may just surprise you. Now, as far as being complicated goes, it's probably just the outward appearance that has a tendency to intimidate people. Now, honestly, it's not the prettiest carburetor out there, but once you know the basics, they're really no more complicated than any other carb. When tearing down for a rebuild, first, remove all the external parts: fuel inlet, choke pull-off, idle stop solenoid, and choke thermostat. When tapping out the roll pin for the accelerator pump lever, be sure to leave a little room behind the pin. This will make it much easier to reinstall.
Next, remove the choke flap lever. Disassemble the top plate from the main body. Remove all 9 screws, including the 2 inside the primary bore. Then carefully pry it off. If yours has been sitting around as long as this one has, you may want to watch out for critters inside. Now, you can completely disassemble the main body.
Finally, remove the base plate from the main body. Remove the 2 retaining screws, the air-fuel mixture screws, then pry it off. Hang on to the gasket for now. We'll tell you why later.
The base plate, main body, and top plate are all ready to be cleaned, so I'm going to give it a bath while we're gone to break. But when we get back, we're going to continue this QJet makeover. Hey, welcome back. I soaked our QuadraJet for over an hour, scrubbed it with a brush, rinsed it out, blew it off with some air. To give these old parts that stock look, I'm going to give the top plate and the main body a quick coat of this Eastwood's Carb Renew. This paint is designed for the outside of the carb only, so try to keep as much off the inside as possible.
While we wait for the paint to dry, I'm going to get working on the base plate. Now, one of the main things that can really cause problems with a QJet is a worn primary shaft. Now, it's real commonly overlooked during the rebuild, but I'll tell you, it can make tuning one of these things just about impossible. Now, we're going to repair this one with a bushing kit, but first, I need to disassemble it and clean it by blasting it. It's a good idea to label the flaps. They are side-specific, and you don't want to get them mixed up. With the flaps removed, the throttle shafts slide right out. I'm giving the base plate a quick blasting before reassembling. A wire brush and some elbow grease will work fine too. Next, I'll drill out the throttle shaft bores to make room for the repair bushings. Now, the idea here is to only drill it as far as the bushing is going to set in there. That way you have a lip that'll prevent that bushing from falling all the way through and ending up in there against your throttle blades. That's what that piece of tape is there for. It's a depth guide. I'm using a brass hammer here to keep from damaging the bushings like a steel hammer might. Some WD-40 on some 1000 grit smooths away any leftover funk. With everything cleaned up, the shafts can slide back in place, along with the fast idle levers and spring. Now with the bushings installed, you can see that took up all the slack out of our shaft, so we don't have to worry about a vacuum leak there anymore. The next thing to check for is to make sure that on wide open throttle, your blades are sitting to 90. Now it looks good.
Another common problem of the QuadraJets are the leaking bottom plugs. It's not that hard of a repair. Some simple homemade plugs and some epoxy and a little bit of time, get it fixed, no problem. First, drill out the old plugs, making sure not to go too deep. Tap out the holes with a bottoming tap, and then mix up some epoxy. I already made a pair of plugs by chopping up some 1/2-inch bolts. A quick dip in the epoxy will seal the threads. A dab on the top seals the deal. Once our epoxy dries, we can assemble our main body to the base plate. Now always save your old gaskets, because carburetor kits usually come with an assortment. Try to keep them in one piece, that way it's a lot easier to match them up. That's it. This is the easy part. Just 2 screws attach the base plate back to the main body. I'm taking some 1000 grip to the pump and power piston bores to remove any imperfections. Now we're ready to install the primary jets. I like to replace these when doing a rebuild because just like the throttle shaft, they're probably worn also. Now they come in a lot of different sizes, but Edelbrock's calibration kit has got a big assortment. You won't know what size you need until you get into the carburetor, but doesn't matter which one you have, this kit has got you covered. After installing the jets, I'm using an old check ball and a punch to reform the seat before installing the new one. One of the performance upgrades you can do to help out an old QuadraJet is to simply swap out the needle and seat assembly with a high flow unit like the one supplied in our calibration kit. What this does is helps keep the carburetor from running out of fuel at wide open throttle. When doing a rebuild, I always like to swap out the float for a new one. Sometimes it's easy to tell when they're bad, other times not so much. And for about $7, that's some pretty cheap insurance. Once the new float is in place, I need to set the level. This kit includes a chart showing what the level should be for your model. Adjust by bending the arm. It's very important to get an accurate level or you're just wasting your time. Next, the power valve and primary metering rods drop in, and the float splash guard and gasket go on. Another performance upgrade for the QuadraJet is either to swap out or simply shorten the accelerator pump. What this does is it increases the pump volume during quick movement of the throttle. These brass tubes have been known to fall out, so I'm keeping them in place with a few light taps of a hammer. Use Loctite on the flap screws because you don't want them to back out, fall through the carb, and wind up inside your engine. For the final assembly, reattach the top plate and all the external components you removed on disassembly. So that's one way to spruce up an old QuadraJet. This was a stock rebuild with a couple of exceptions, but there's plenty of performance parts available out there if you need to go more in that direction. So I'm going to go bolt this on my old Buick GS, try it out. But stay tuned, there's a lot more muscle car coming up.